Hello everyone, how's it going? It is Tyrnor as always, and I wanted to bring you a bit more of a discussion and update video since, as I'm sure you might have noticed, I just came out of a long hiatus. Now, I suppose the first and most obvious question is, where have you been and why have you stopped making videos and such? So I suppose we'll tackle that first. But building upon my answer, I want to discuss a bit the way World of Warcraft does storytelling and why it can be really irritating at times. For convenience's sake, I'm going to divide the video into 4 parts, which you can see on the screen here, as well as having timestamps for each one if you're interested in only some particular parts of the video. So, where have I been? Well, the short and truthful answer is that I have been really busy with IRL stuff in the past year, which barely left me with any free time. But still, there has to have been some free time where I could at least make some videos, right? Well, leaving aside that these videos take a really long time to make, the simple truth of the matter is that I really didn't feel up to it, honestly, because I just didn't enjoy playing World of Warcraft. Now, I bet your first reaction was, oh, I bet you're playing that one other MMORPG, Final Fantasy, whatever Roman numeral it is, right? Well, no, not at all. Please put down your pitchfork. Whenever I had some free time, I did not spend it playing World of Warcraft, or any other MMORPG for that matter. I spent it playing this stuff. Yep, strategy games are my all-time favorite genre. I don't really play and I don't like MMORPGs at all. World of Warcraft was the only exception to this preference of mine. And even then, I only played the single player stuff. I don't raid, not even LFR, I only do dungeons when I'm required to by quests, and I don't PvP. You actually used to be a hardcore raider in Wrath of the Lich King. In fact, I was one of the best DPS on the server, but that's only because I was playing with friends and that guild has long since disbanded. Without friends to play with, I just don't want to do that stuff. Obviously, no judgment whatsoever to people who enjoy the genre, to PvPers, to raiders, whatever you may be. Honestly, if I were to play a different MMORPG than WoW, it wouldn't be Final Fantasy whatever number, or Guild Wars, or whatever game is competing with World of Warcraft now. It would probably be Star Wars The Old Republic, but I'm not playing that, so... Anyway, why have I stopped playing the game at all in this time of hiatus? Well, in addition to just not having that much free time and preferring to spend that little free time playing games I personally like more, there's 2 things about Battle for Azeroth that just made me stop playing the game. Before I get into it, I would just like to preface this by saying that all of this is just my personal preference as a person who does not really ever play MMOs. First and foremost is the fact that the story is effectively split into between the Alliance and the Horde storylines, which obviously makes sense, but in practical terms, it just makes things frustrating and confusing. As a mainly Horde player, just as an example, I have no idea who Lady Ashvane is and why Sylvanas freeing her is so shocking. The game simply does not tell you, I have to look this stuff up online. When I was playing, I barely had the time to keep up with the Horde's endgame storyline, so I obviously couldn't find the time to level an Alliance character. But what's worse isn't the fact that I didn't have the time, but rather that I dread leveling in Battle for Azeroth. It took me about 3 months to get to max level as a Horde in Battle for Azeroth simply because of how much I disliked it. It's the first expansion where I felt I was getting weaker and weaker as I leveled up, where actually hitting that next level is an object of dread and not of accomplishment. I even enjoyed leveling in the vanilla zones of World of Warcraft more since, while it might have been dull and frustrating at times, at least it felt like I was progressing through the game. So for instance, Worlds of Draenor also had a similar problem with Battle for Azeroth in that the storyline was split between the Alliance and the Horde, although to a much smaller extent, but that wasn't really a problem for me because I found leveling it to be fun in Worlds of Draenor. Now the second issue for me is that I'm not really a fan of the current storyline, which is basically split into 2 main issues or topics: the Alliance versus Horde conflict and the Old Gods. I'm going to start with the latter since that takes a little less explaining. The Old Gods storyline post-Cataclysm is okay at best for me. The Old Gods are cool, but the majority of the lore surrounding them nowadays is a lot of cryptic stuff that you can interpret in 1,000 different ways and in the end doesn't really matter. I'll talk about this a little more when I get to the next section. The main issue for me is the Alliance vs Horde storyline. Now, I think you can do a good Alliance vs Horde story, but not in World of Warcraft. That's because the game and the player base is split between the two factions, and you really can't have one winning without pissing the other off. Every single victory by one faction has to be a Pyrrhic victory. Every single defeat has to be presented like it's the most valiant defeat there ever was. And what's worse is that both in Mists of Pandaria and in Battle for Azeroth, the Horde is the evil faction, and that's kind of been the case since Warcraft 1, come to think of it. But what I mean is that I would love to see a faction war between two morally grey factions, the Horde and the Alliance. Not one where the war chief of the Horde is a genocidal maniac, again, and one that is not done in World of Warcraft. In my opinion, making the Horde evil has been done to death, while making the Alliance evil would just seem bizarre. Now there's a third issue I have, but it's one that's related to World of Warcraft in general, not to anything in particular done by Battle for Azeroth, which is the way that they do lore. Now, as you can see by my Lore Facts series, when it comes to the lore, I generally prefer to see the world building that goes into the game, with the primary storyline taking a second place for me, personally. Now, there's many ways to do world building lore, but for the purposes of this discussion, I'm going to define two approaches, two general philosophies, so to say. Word of God and flavor lore, and use another game as an example to illustrate what I mean. I'm not saying that one way of doing storytelling is better than the other, by the way. Both have their advantages and their disadvantages. World of Warcraft does its world building mostly through the Word of God approach. You are told specific pieces of lore directly, either in the game or via outside sources like the novels, and that lore cannot really be interpreted or bent. It's very inflexible. Except when it's not, but I'll get to that later. Now, as an example of the flavor lore approach, I'll take the Elder Scrolls series. As a note, I have not played the Elder Scrolls Online, I have only played Oblivion and Skyrim, and I'm working off of those two games, though honestly, it would not surprise me if Online had the same approach as the other two games. Anyway, the Elder Scrolls are the embodiment, in my opinion, of world building through flavor lore, which basically means that the lore is not told to you directly, but rather you hear it from the characters and books in the game, and as such, there's no single definite version of it. Rather, there are as many versions as there are retellings of that particular lore. To illustrate an example, let's take one of the greatest current mysteries in Warcraft's lore, which is Elune, and compare it to another mysterious deity in the Elder Scrolls, Sithis. In regards to Elune, I can't tell you what she is. I have no idea what she could possibly be, since the Word of God has not told us yet. She could be anything from a Titan to a Naru, and there's no way to say for sure without Blizzard telling us directly at this point. Now, Sithis, on the other hand, is defined in a dozen different ways in the Elder Scrolls. Some characters define him as the primordial chaos of the universe, others as the father of the Daedra, others as a Daedra himself, others as a cosmic force with no clear definition, and so on and so forth. The difference between the two is, in World of Warcraft, eventually, at some point, we'll find out what Elune is, and all the speculations we have with beforehand will become entirely pointless, except for our own entertainment at the time. Which is partly why I don't really like the Old Gods storyline that much, since speculating on the future of Warcraft's lore is almost pointless, except, and this is important for our own entertainment, and I'm just not that big of a fan personally of Lovecraftian stories. In the Elder Scrolls, we'll probably never find out exactly what Sithis is, and speculation is all that we have to go on. Let's take the wiki pages for the two to illustrate a perfect example. The wiki page for Elune provides the very few pieces of information we have on Elune herself, without actually managing to define her exactly, then mostly talks about how various other creatures have interacted with her, such as Cenarius being her son, or how the Night Elves came to worship her and such. The wiki page for Sithis is mostly a grab bag of semi-random information. Some people believe Sithis is this, while others associate Sithis with another concept, and so on and so forth. Now, both of these forms of world building have their advantages and disadvantages. The Word of God approach has the main advantage that basically you know what you're dealing with. You're very rarely left in the dark and confused when it comes to the story, while the flavor lore approach has the advantage of being much more immersive since it feels like you're in a living world instead of playing through a story someone has designed. Now the disadvantage of flavor lore is that, as we have seen, very few things are defined clearly, and more often than not, you're left stumbling in the dark when it comes to complex pieces of lore, often even in the case of pieces of lore that have been previously defined. The main disadvantage of the Word of God approach is that it's extremely dependent on continuity on previous pieces of lore. If something happens in the lore that contradicts a piece of previously established lore, for the flavor lore approach you can just say, oh well, the guy who said the previous lore must have just been wrong, and it's normal, people make mistakes. While for the Word of God approach, where everything is very clearly defined, it becomes a plot hole that needs fixing. And this is one of the big drawbacks of World of Warcraft storytelling, that there are so many people working in the story department that naturally it's hard to keep the lore straight. The people at Blizzard have also specifically said that they consider the current story to be more important than sticking to the established lore, so the answer to what happens when the story that they tell does not fit previous lore is that they retcon previous lore. It never happened, or it happened differently. Which, well, for a channel like mine that focuses on the minutiae of lore, you can imagine how frustrating this can be. So let's take my lore facts series. If I were to also do lore facts on the Elder Scrolls universe, as well as give both series of lore facts completely accurate and honest titles, these would be Warcraft lore facts. Unless it's about something extremely irrelevant, half of these facts will no longer be true in about 3 to 4 years. And Elder Scrolls lore facts. Most of these are not facts, just the subjective ramblings of usually crazy people. Feel free to come up with your own interpretations of these pieces of trivia. Another issue with World of Warcraft's Word of God approach is the inflexibility I alluded to earlier. Namely that unless something has been specifically stated to be otherwise, then that piece of lore is still true even if it makes no sense. I'll take an example from the lore facts I've just done, the Auchenai, where I mentioned that there is a quest in Burning Crusade which has you fight the resurrected, quote, first Exarch of the Crypts, a Draenei Auchenai Exarch preceding Maladar. Now, in the story they've established, it makes very little sense for there to have been an Auchenai Exarch preceding Maladar, since pretty much he's responsible for the founding of their order. And yet, since there is no place in the lore which states that Maladar was the first Exarch of the Auchenai, then this guy, who doesn't even have a name, canonically was the first Exarch. And even though it doesn't make sense, and it almost certainly is not Blizzard's intent, since it's not been specifically stated otherwise, canonically this random guy was the first Exarch. Now, obviously that's not to say that World of Warcraft has never employed the flavor lore approach. Mists of Pandaria was the expansion where this was present the most. Just as an example, the story of Emperor Shao Hao has two different versions which differ from each other even if the general idea is the same. Shao Hao purges doubt, despair, anger, fear, hatred and violence from himself, then becomes one of the land and separates Pandaria from the rest of the world. There's what we saw in the Burdens of Shao Hao video series, where Shao Hao basically goes on an adventure, but there's also the version found in the lore scrolls in Pandaria, where Shao Hao cleansed these Shao with the aid of a mask of the Monkey Kings, and where the Jade Serpent is the only August Celestial who's really relevant to the story. And this isn't the only example, it's part of the reason why I love Mists of Pandaria storytelling so much, since there's so much lore you hear from NPCs, and that so much of this lore is no longer inflexible facts. Instead, they are legends which may or may not have actually happened, and probably not in the exact form they are told in. Circling back a bit, one of my issues with Battle for Azeroth is that they're not just retconning events that happened, but also individual characters' personalities to a greater or lesser extent. The most egregious examples in my opinion being Lillian Voss and Rexxar, at least on the Horde side. Although really it's not the first, and it probably won't be the last time that they do this stuff. Also another thing that kind of annoys me is that Blizzard printed these giant compendiums of lore, the World of Warcraft Chronicle, which was intended to be the definitive version of the lore so far, the final not retconnable version from which all future lore shall spring, and before the series was even finished, they've already started retconning stuff from the first volume. Anyway, moving on, what's the future of this channel? Well, I'm going to do a little experiment for the following weeks. On Tuesday, I'll do the Magar Allied Race introductory storyline in order to give my thoughts on it. I know it's really behind the times, but it's something I've wanted to talk about ever since it came out. There will be a lore facts on Thursday and a general lore video on Saturday. This week will be an experiment to see how well I can manage with making a large volume of videos in a single week, and based on the results we'll see about moving forward with the channel. Now, I'm also interested in trying out a Q&A video, either Warcraft related or life related or whatever. Usually I respond to any questions in the comments, but this would also be a simple way of pumping out videos and it might prove to be interesting. It also has the advantage of, for instance, if someone asks a particularly interesting lore question, other people might also be interested in hearing my response, instead of having it buried in the comment section. If anyone would be interested in that, please let me know in the comments below. Also, on a final note, probably not this coming week, but the next one, I'm thinking of live streaming the Alliance leveling in BFA, Facecam and all that. It's also a way to get my reactions to the cinematics, but I also think it would be a more fun way to level for me than the tedium of just doing it by myself. Regardless, I will let you know when that's going to happen. Other than that, thank you all very much for watching and listening to me, and I'll see you all later. Farewell.